Good afternoon, everybody who has joined us. My name is Holger Klein. I'm the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, and it is a great pleasure for me today to welcome you all to the lecture of Fatma Müge Göçek, who is professor in the Department of Sociology and the Program of Women's Studies at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. After her talk here at Columbia was canceled in the spring due to the COVID crisis, we are particularly grateful that Müge Göçek has agreed to be the first speaker of the Sakıp Sabancı's fall lineup of lectures and events, which will all be conducted via Zoom. And if you're interested, put yourself on our mailing list and you will be notified of future lectures when they are coming up. Today's lecture by Professor Göçek is co-sponsored by the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies and Columbia's Department of Sociology. And I would like to thank both Seamus Khan, the former chair of the Department of Sociology, and Bruce Weston, its current chair and Bryce Professor of Sociology and Social Justice, and also co-director of the Justice Lab here at Columbia University, for working with us to host this lecture. I will turn the podium over to Bruce in a second so that he can give Professor Göçek a proper scholarly introduction. But before I do so, I would like to thank both the staff of the Department of Sociology and the Sakıp Sabancı Center, especially Sharon Kim, who has been working behind the scenes both in the spring and over the last couple of weeks to make this event possible. I would also like to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today and encourage you to join us also for the discussion section after the talk proper. If you do want to participate in the discussion in person, everybody should raise their blue Zoom hand at that point, and I will take the moderation on and ask the speakers who want to ask questions to identify themselves and to then ask their questions. Depending on how long the lecture will run, we will have more or less time for questions, so we will see where we are after Professor Göçek's lecture. But do use that blue Zoom hand so that you can be in the lineup. Without further ado, Bruce, I will turn the podium over to you and let you introduce Professor Göçek.
Thanks very much, Holger, and it's great to be working with you on the presentation of this seminar. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Fatma Müge Göçek. Müge is a professor of sociology and women's studies at the University of Michigan. She's a comparative historical sociologist who studies politics and gender, and her research has examined processes of development, nationalism, and collective violence. She's the author of 4 books examining in different ways the Ottoman origins of modern Turkey and the dynamics of contemporary Turkish society. Her most recent book, which was published by Oxford in 2015, is called The Denial of Violence, Ottoman Past, Turkish Present, and the Collective Violence Against the Armenians, 1789 to 2009. The book won the Mary Douglas Best Book Award from the Culture section of the American Sociological Association, and was also honorably mentioned for the Barrington Moore Award at ASA. Among her many distinctions, she's a member of the French Ministry of Education's Commission on Genocide Research. She's a winner of the Middle East Studies Association's Academic Freedom Award, and she's been a senior fellow at the Michigan Society of Fellows. Her talk today is titled The Origins of Contemporary Violence, Turkey and the United States, and I'm very interested to hear this discussion. Thank you, Müge, for being with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me finally give the talk. It took a long time, but the whole world changed in the process. So it is an honor to be talking, especially at Columbia, because of luminaries like C. Wright Mills and Edward Said, who are my heroes in different ways. And also because of the Sakıp Sabancı Center, since he was such an important person and leader in Turkey, and it is wonderful to have this connection again established because of that because of who he is and what he stands for. So I am thrilled, and also it is fascinating because thanks to this online presentation, I think sociology, or at least my work, has become truly global because people can literally zoom in and watch it from wherever they are in the world. I mean, so that is, I think, truly a global practice that we have through this walk, through this talk. So what I wanted to do with you is first thank everybody for presenting this opportunity for me, especially Andreas Wimmer, who has been wonderful in supporting me giving this talk, and Bruce Western, as well as Holger Klein, of course, and Sharon Kim at Sakıp Sabancı Center. I thank you all for this. What I am going to do today deals with the new project that I am embarking on after the Denial of Violence project. And you will understand in a little while how that's going to work out. So what I'm here now is basically after writing the Denial of Violence book, I realized the significance, at least, of collective violence. Why is it that it is important to focus on collective violence against minorities? Because that is what I am now doing with my work. Well, it's interesting that violence, unlike either conflict or consensus, has within it two components. There is the act, the behavior, but there is also the emotions that come with it. And usually emotions is, of course, an aspect that we haven't fully dealt with in the context of sociological research, because people argue of the Enlightenment thinking that, of course, privileges reason over emotions. So we have realized that the exclusion has, of course, worked against those who do not share equally in the power structure. As a consequence, it is very important to bring that component in as well, the experiential component, in addition to the knowledge production one, is another way of putting it. So collective violence has a way of focusing things at the event there and then, and it articulates, because violence itself requires at least usually more than one person. There is a perpetrator, obviously, as well as a survivor. It enables us to look at both parties rather than only focusing on the victim and rarely focusing on the perpetrator. That is why I think violence as a component, as a concept, is much stronger than other concepts. With respect to minorities, of course, people argue that the linchpin of a democracy is not how the majority is treated, because obviously it is the majority that helps construct the social system, especially the institutions, the organizations, with respect to the norms, values, and practices of that particular social group. As a consequence, the linchpin of whether a democracy is working is not whether the majority is happy with what's going on, because that is the whole system is predicated on their orientation anyhow, but rather how the minorities whose values, norms, and practices are not reflected in the social system, how they are doing, so that in any democracy, the way minorities are treated gives us the best sort of indication of how people are treated in that particular context. And of course, when you are thinking about minorities, the way I define minority and majority is a very simple way of arguing that basically minorities are those social groups who do not share equally in the resources that are considered to be valuable by that particular society. So that anyone, literally by that definition, that is not sharing equally will be considered a minority. That's a sociological definition, even though, of course, if you think about it rhetorically, there is a lot of concern about who is a minority and who is not a minority. If you think about, for example, how in the Turkish context, the Kurds never think of themselves as a minority because they are a constitutive element, as far as they're concerned, of the Turkish Republic, which was then denied to them. Whereas in the United States, for example, even, I'm from Turkey of Middle Eastern origin, therefore, I'm not considered a minority because I presumably belong to the whites, or I come from Caucasia, literally. So that also demonstrates, how this is a socially constructed definition. But nevertheless, what's important in that construction form is the power dimension of it and how that structures the things in society at large. So in my earlier work that Bruce kindly talked about, the denial of violence, I was looking at the violence against Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. And what that book enabled me to do is I did not want to look at it from the vantage point of the West or Western scholarship, but rather go and have the people there on the ground tell what was going on and how did they see, live, and interpret the violence they were in. So what's important is that it's a bottom-up approach. It actually focuses on the society itself, and then it looks at how violence changes over time and how the denial of the violence against the Armenians is a process that starts pretty much with the introduction of systematic Western modernity into the Ottoman Empire, and then continues to 2009, which is where I had to stop because you have to stop somewhere. So that is what I was looking at, the violence. And the three major findings I had were, is that I was able to, I didn't want to use government documents, and I used memoirs. I read about 700-800 memoirs and used 350 of them in order to see how was it that people conceptualized what was going on. And these memoirs were almost predominantly written by perpetrators, which allowed me to then see how they perceived what they were doing and how that changed. And what is, I think, very important, the major finding, is that all too often when we study minorities, we only focus on the minorities without locating them in the larger, social structure. As a consequence, we do not see, especially the relationship of the survivors to the perpetrators. And with these memoirs, almost the majority of them belong to perpetrators. So I was able to see the dynamics of violence much more from the vantage point of the perpetrators as well as the survivors. The second major finding, that violence is layered, erased, redefined over time. So there is a certain historicity to it, in the sense that violence gets negotiated differently at different stages. And that is something I was able to get, the patterns I was able to get by looking at all these memoirs over time to see what those structures were like. And the third one is violence is sort of reproduced, suppressed through intersections. Intersectionality also became very important in the sense that certain categories, like sexuality, gender, and others, also intersected in certain ways in both social groups to then complicate the picture more. And these three aspects, connectedness, historicity, and intersectionality, are three dimensions that I decided to use on my next work, future work. So next steps in the analysis of this. So I'm at the moment, literally, I finished the book and I'm in the middle of the next project. I, at the moment, have two things that are going on at the same time. I wanted to extend social actors domestically, from Armenians to Kurds in Turkey. Because after basically Armenians are decimated, the Kurds emerge as the most significant minority, although they do not call themselves as such, in the Turkish Republic. Kurds form about 17% of the population. They are mostly located in the southeast, but they have also been forcefully moved to major cities in the west, so they are pretty much all over. And the people, if you look at the officers and officials who had been engaged in the Armenian genocide later, were also serving to suppress the Kurds. So there is a continuation of the collective violence that I'm interested in the contemporary era, as the Armenians are replaced by Kurds as the minority. So what is also interesting is when I was looking at violence, it almost looked like those who actually were killed by the violence had an easier time than those who survived. And that alerted me to the impact violence has on societies in general, because you know, when you're a survivor, I mean, you die and you're done. But if you survive physically, then there is a lot of emotional distress that you have in trying to come to terms with the society you live in, the moral fabric that enabled them to carry this violence against you. I mean, you know, you have everyday experiences of violence, so that brings, I think, violence that we usually conceptualize only in terms of the body, the embodiment and what's happening. I expand that to the mind and spirit, like, you know, the Native Americans have sort of conceptualized, because there is, I think, a mental dimension to it and also a communal aspect that are just as important to take into account. What I have done is I have 60 interviews done with sort of three groups of Kurds through the snowball sampling, where I look at both the violence against their body, which especially torture in prisons, you know, and there is now a lot of literature on how the body becomes basically weaponized and instrumentalized with violence, and we can talk more about that if you're interested. To the mind, this is the sort of mental dimension of it, where, for example, it is extremely important for them to feel, of course, that they are connected to what's going on. But if you think about sort of the mental dimension of this, for example, there is a lot of violence that they need to process that is very much focused not on the material, but the ideological, the ideas, thoughts, and engagement of with what's going on around here. I mean, this always reminds me of W. Du Bois's double consciousness, because, you know, that's another way of, like, you know, capturing what is going on in two different levels. And the spirit, the communal, has to do much more. For example, do they see themselves, and can they be seen as a part of the social group they belong to? And in this context, of course, the forced removal of, you know, Kurds from their villages, for example, their forced migration into large Western Turkish cities is another aspect of that violence. There is also, of course, violence that goes from one generation to the other, and it changes form as it is, translated. Now, that is one way. So I have the data. I haven't yet able to get to it. I learned Kurdish, Kurmanji Kurdish in the process. So that is on the back burner because I am now focusing on another aspect because of what's going on in the world. I thought this would be more important for me to tackle first. So I'm extending social actors from the Kurds in Turkey to Black people in the United States by expanding the concept of minorities globally. And as their association to power and ensuing violence forms in accordance with historicity, connectedness, and intersectionality. So this is the one that I'm focusing on. Why? I mean, because as you know, with respect to what's going on, there is this whole tension between the micro and the macro, the local and the global. How do you come up and work, at least with these sociologically? Which one do you prioritize and how does that impact what you come up with? In that context, I thought, what if I tried to come up with a model that doesn't privilege let's say the survivors focusing only on what's happening locally. And on the other hand, I didn't also want to just focus on not the survivors, but the perpetrators and what's happening there. But can we take it and expand it in a sociological paradigm that captures both the local dynamics as well as the sort of global processes that emerge from this violence. So where do I stand in relation to what's going on? I have been in touch with theoretically with developing, as I said, a global critical approach to collective violence against minorities in conversation with the domestic and global Du Boisian net framework that has just started to emerge in the recent works of Ixon and Brown, and I have it down there, 2020 Sociology of W.B. Du Bois, Racial as Modernity and the Global Color Line, which is amazing. And of course, Patricia Hill Collins's work on intersectionality as critical theory, and that's where I get the dimension of intersectionality. Then there is the work of Zino Magubane on American sociology's racial ontology, and Alden Morris is, of course, scholar denied with W. Du Bois. That sort of brings us a lot of questions about how do we define sociology as a discipline? What are the boundaries, and how should we define American sociology? Should we start with the sort of Chicago roots that very much emphasize the experience of white settlers, or should we instead focus on, those who were here, the indigenous, of course, natives, and as well as later Black Americans who were, of course, forcefully brought here. So that is the sort of aspect that applies to especially American sociology, and how can we rethink it along those lines. And that is brought together with the global aspect of it, and that is why I have, for example, Kimberly Huang, who talks about how things are from the vantage point of Vietnam, and using the Du Boisian framework in that context, as well as Gurvinder Bamra, of course, who is very interested in connected sociologies, as well as Julian Go, who, of course, is interested in both local and global. Whoops. Well, I went ahead of myself. Okay, here we go. So then these are the cast of characters that I am in conversation with. And if we are developing a global critical approach to analyze collective violence against the minorities, what are the underlying assumptions with which I'm going on? It's sort of radical conflict oriented and emancipatory. These are the three aspects of this approach. So aim is to change the system based on Western modernity by overcoming material, ideological, and virtual challenges. This is why I look at violence, and it's emancipatory to achieve social justice, emancipation, just participation. So these are, of course, as you can imagine, different. It's radical because it wants to change the system rather than reform it. It's conflict-oriented in a sense. Again, it tackles what's not working rather than what is working, like a consensus approach. So it's not interested in reproducing the status quo, rather much more interested in transforming how things are, and it's emancipatory. Whereas, in the typical mainstream sociological practice, we think objectivity and the sort of community of scholars decide what is done right or wrong, and that is supposed to sort of give us the closest approximation of social reality. But we're supposed to be objective and neutral, but I think what's important about the critical approach is that it says the human, being is so reflexive. It's sort of, at the same time, we always shape what we're studying because of who we are as scholars and because of the nature of humans in general. As a consequence, rather than going with this abstract thing, it's much more important to openly say that the aim is to achieve social justice so everybody participates in it equally. So based on these underlying assumptions, I sort of came up with a triangulation approach. The idea sort of comes from journalism, where you have to at least have like three sources for to capture what may be the truth. And I thought, since Western modernity is based on binarisms, black and white dualisms all the time, what is important is that if we go from that to a triangulation, so that rather than having, in addition to especially perpetrators and survivors, what's important is sort of the third, I bring in a third component of a sort of scholarly self-reflexivity, but also at the same time, all interpreters and interlocutors who become much more important during Western modernity than they did before. So we're talking about educational institutions, the social media, all these professional experts that interpret things for us and come up with narratives. They are portrayed as independent of the other two, but I would argue are much more in line with, of course, the perpetrators rather than the survivors or the minorities. And that is a very important, dynamic that comes, I think, with Western modernities. So the standpoint of minorities is how I approach this violence in relation to the actions of the majority and the narrative of interpreters, and challenges articulated through collective violence. And that's how I did with the denial of violence. I looked at, for example, of all instances of violence, collective violence against Armenians throughout Ottoman and Turkish history. That's what, I think is a good way of looking not only at sort of seeing, interpreting what the minorities are doing, but also the majority as well. And power of social actors is distributed and thus retained, reproduced, or lost in relation to, as I said, historicity, connectedness, and intersectionality. So this is my attempts. I'm terrible at these things, but just so that there is sort of agency, elements of power, and violence, sort of ensuing violence. So what I do here is I have two triangles, hence triangulation, where if, for example, I look at everything from the minorities, vantage point of minorities here, and then there is obviously the majority actions that sort of lead to the violence. But I argue that with Western modernity, you have this interpreter narratives that also emerge, that sort of, I think, double the pressure on minorities. And what happens is that this leads to the sort of formation of how violence then is processed in a particular society. And it is within this realm that you have, through the introduction of the concepts of intersectionality, connectedness, and historicity, how violence then transforms and forms over time. So this is basically how the model works. But of course, it's much better if you look at it empirically. So I'm now going to look very quickly at, how what I'm saying works in the context of Turkey and the United States, and what it allows us to see in ways that we haven't been able to have we used another framework. So from that vantage point, I have to say, of course, this is challenging because it brings the whole issue of comparing the United States, which is a superpower, with Turkey, which is a developing country, obviously. And as a consequence, people usually have a hard time comparing such two countries because they are seen, obviously, as being located at very different places in the world order. But I would argue that there are certain similarities that enable, and differences that we can study within this critical framework that go beyond the limitations that are brought by comparing two vastly different things. And in a way, such a comparison also enables us to see everything globally. And in our case, in the case of the United States, to be able to go beyond sort of the American exceptionalism or the manifest destiny and all these things that at least conservative interpretations come up with in order to keep America, the United States, separate from such comparisons with other countries. The other aspect of it is, of course, when you look at it from the vantage point of Turkey, which is how I'm reversing things, usually because of Western Enlightenment, knowledge being located in the West, people look at things from the vantage point of the West to the rest of the world. By doing so, though, as we know, they also structure knowledge and practices. What I'm doing is I'm switching that. So rather than coming from the West and looking at the non-West, coming from a white-dominated place and looking at non-whites, I'm doing the opposite. I'm looking at how things shape in Turkey and using Turkey as my main, framework from which to then look at the United States, because that shifts and changes epistemologically what forms as a consequence. And that, I think, is important to think about as well. So what do? I start with, and I've also forgot, in addition to that, what brings Turkey and the United States together for me, of course, is my own subjectivity. Because as a scholar, I was born and raised in Turkey, and then I have come to this country. You can argue that, I have experiences now in both countries, and more, actually, I will be more here than in Turkey. Nevertheless, it sort of enables me to see things in a different way. My expertise is Turkey. Obviously, that's sort of what knowledge I have to present the world. But at the same time, I am a part of course, much. I live in the United States, so I have an experience here, and I teach on American society. So how can I, as a scholar, as a sociologist, study these two foci that I have in my work together? How can I look at the global South together with the global North? That is what I'm trying to do, to bring into sort of one framework, at least theoretically, these different terms. If you look at Turkey, then how do I define minorities? Initially, of course, there were non-Muslim minorities or religious minorities, as they're called, in the Ottoman Empire, where we have the Greek, Rome, Armenians, and Jews. Then what happens is that these pretty much get decimated during the last stages of the Ottoman Empire. And when we go into the Turkish Republic, as I said, the leading minority group are the Kurds, and they become sort of the new Armenians, so to speak. There is a saying in Kurdish that Turks said Armenians for breakfast and Kurds, they'll have Kurds for lunch. So that is sort of a continuity of the vector of violence that's important to think about. The majority are, in this case, Sunni Muslims, urban, and ethnically Turkish. I mean, you know, like me, for example. So I am a part of the majority in that context. And with respect to interpreters, I mean, these range from mostly male educators, clergy, scientists, and academics, public journalists, public intellectuals and journalists, I messed up, and artists. These are professionals, and I would argue that that narrative is almost as significant as the acts of violence that you see between perpetrators and survivors. So if you look at the United States, of course, the minorities are the indigenous people, of course, especially Native Americans who get decimated from 1492 onwards, to racialized Black people later on. You know, once the natives are decimated and their land plundered, then what you have is, of course, Black people who are forcefully brought in as slaves, and they then, of course, become the sort of the official minority of the United States. There is the white American majority, in this case, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and you know, the color line, as Du Bois says, is the most significant divide. Interpreters, again, range from educators, scientists, academics, officers and officials, public intellectuals, journalists, and artists. And that is also important. Now, as I said, now I have talked about the social actor. How about the power of these social actors? How do they structure events? And there, I think there are three dimensions that are very important for these social actors to make sense of what's going on around them and that shape collective violence. One is historicity. I think remembering violence in difficult pasts is extremely important when we see violence today. The best way, especially for a comparative historical sociologist, is to see how you can then, challenge and question that by returning to the origins of such violence and when did it start. That is why in my case of the Denial of Violence book, I started with 1789, not because of the French Revolution, but it's also the year when Sultan Selim III came to the throne and started systematic Westernization in the Ottoman Empire by transforming the institutions and various organizations along those lines. And this is also the time where the focus shifts from sort of communal protection over, Ottoman social groups to individual protection guaranteed by the state. This is something, of course, Hannah Arendt talks a lot about, how minorities are and are not treated in the context of Europe in her case. But that, I think, the historicity tells a lot about how violence is structured in the first place. Connectedness has to do with the agency of violence, in the sense that you cannot only focus on the victims whenever, bad things happen to them. You also, I think, have to bring into the picture what is going on with the perpetrators, because what is lost and taken away from in resources from the minorities is then, of course, given to the majority. So it is important to see at the same time the connectedness between the victims and the perpetrators, and how what sort of leads to the disadvantage of the victims benefits the perpetrators. That link is usually not there. If you think about our society or in Turkey, it is very difficult to see actually the direct relationship between the perpetrators and the survivors. It's usually the sort of the mediation in civil society through these different narratives that take our attention away from the immediacy of this. I was, as an exercise, tried to do, because I work with reparations, in the context of the Armenian genocide and what could be done. I did a sort of simple exercise and said, well, given, for example, how much we have sort of taken away as a society from Native Americans and later Black Americans, how could we, in sort of neoliberal terms, even the playing field, in neoliberal terms, well, means how much money. So if you look at, how much land there is and what it's worth and how many Native Americans there are in the United States today, it looks like, things will be even if we gave about $20 to $40 million to each Native American living in the United States. Likewise, if you look at the labor, and that has been exploited, especially under slavery, and then continued, of course, with mass incarceration and other such practices, to even the playing field, we have to get each African American $2 to $4 million. So that is a way of sort of seeing that is all the money that has been funneled to reproduce the majority, rather, from the ranks of the minorities. And that is, I think, something one has to think about. And of course, intersectionality becomes very important in this context, specifically because one assesses variation in the violence. So historicity, as I said, is remembering violence, and this is sort of what is very interesting with respect to historicity. And I'll just very quickly take you through this. But when you look at the social actors, here what is important is Armenians and Kurds are the original people in Asia Minor. Once the Turks settled there, they reimagined the past, and they sort of trace their origin back to Central Asia, where all other civilizations flowed. Likewise, if you look at the pivotal moment, foundational violence, what I call, is 1919 to 23, because this is the time, during this time, before the foundation of the Turkish Republic, where the Kurds, as Muslims, were promised, especially with the Amasya Protocols in 1919, local sovereignty. And then, of course, once Turkey was able to sign the treaty at Lausanne and had the Turkish Republic recognized, they reneged on this promise of sovereignty to the Kurds. And then what you have seen is sort of violence, against the Kurds, and rebellions by the Kurds since then. So that is very important as the foundational violence, I argue, because it took the Kurds away from the Turkish body politic, and as a consequence led them to be excluded from then onwards. And that is why we cannot fully bring them into the fold, because they are not a part of the initial construction. Likewise, and this explains sort of the two narratives. And likewise, if you look at the United States and the Black people, I use blacks as a, it's not right, but from the vantage point of Turkey, I sort of said blacks, but the Black people. What's very important there, of course, is the indigenous peoples are here, but once they're settled, what we see is that the white settlers now have like the birthers, so they try to sort of make this history themselves and intentionally exclude indigenous peoples from the body politics. But then, of course, they plunder the land, transforming into private property and then exploiting the labor of Black people through the institution of slavery. I mean, so you have the plunder of land and exploitation of labor. So what is the pivotal moment in all this? I would argue the origins of today go back to 1776 and 83. Basically, first, the Declaration of Rights, and later, the Constitution. There too, when you look at it, it is very significant that there is no mention of Native Americans or of Blacks, even though this was extremely significant because of the tension in the United States over slavery. Violence is justified in the name of civilizational progress and destiny. And what you see then, of course, is that there is this process through which, the rebellions are silenced, and you do see gradually that even though the official federal abolition of slavery occurred in 1865, slavery still continues because I argue the white majority instrumentalizes law not to free Blacks but sustain violence against them in other forms such as mass incarceration. So that is sort of the empirical analysis of historicity. If you turn to sort of connectedness, who defines violence at whose expense, the origins of the color line and double, consciousness as important here. And when you look at the empirical analysis of connectedness, you see that in Turkey, the elimination of the Armenians sort of literally took them out of the equation and made people say Turkey and Kurds face each other one-on-one. Turkish ethnic majority also plundered this non-Muslim wealth and real estate. And later on, there were the pogroms, 1934, 55, 64, as well as, that reduced non-Muslim wealth. And then I would say the same methods were then applied to the Kurds, where Kurds are now portrayed as the ultimate enemy of the Turkish state and society. And so that's where you see, even though there is a lot of aggression against the Kurds, it's obfuscated because you do not see the origins of the violence, and it's sort of, you get it through the narratives that usually silence the perpetrators' direct role in this. If you look at the United States and Blacks, you see Black people, you see Native Americans as a significant minority group occurs. Then white intentional work is taken out, isolating the Black people. And as a consequence, what you see is, interestingly enough, the custody of Native Americans are given to the US federal state and its legal system, whereby the Congress has the double power of signing treaties with natives, while also becoming the adjudicators of such the very same treaties and eliminating them. So you see the power, the sort of inequity there very visibly. And then likewise, if you think about Black slaves, how they are first treated as private property, then with the 3/5 compromise, you realize that they also are kept separate from, the perpetrators and the system that brings them down, so that because of the sort of also the ideology of individualism, they blame themselves for what's going on instead of systemic racism. And that is also sort of dealing with intersectionality, where I sort of go into the definition and talk about, at least in the empirical analysis, how the initial polarization is traced back to the, as I said, the introduction of systemic modernity. Kurds are marginalized into being sort of poor replicas of the Turks, so that Turkey doesn't even recognize Kurds as an ethnic racial group, even though they are. And that is very important and in a way different from the way the Black people are seen in the United States, because there, what I think happens is that people focus much more on the variation within Black Americans across regions, initial points of origin, or colorism, to all interpret this sort of complexity as a way to argue that you can only do description and not causal analysis. But you can, I would argue, if you bring in the dimension of power, that sort of also leads to see how very similar to the way Kurdish language, culture and such was abandoned and suppressed. Likewise, Black Americans' languages, culture and art are likewise decimated. And in a way that demonstrates that also the systematic inequity, especially in the aftermath of how World War II with the GI Bill, you see the creation of a white majority class, by leaving out, of course, those who participated in it, including women and Black people. So what I wanted to do then with all of these is to give you a sense of how these different dimensions of power and violence come together to inform what's happening in Turkey and in the United States within the same framework. And this is what I think in a global world we need to do, is to put these sort of areas of the world in conversation with each other in terms that both focus and highlight and have space for those minorities that are trying to survive in the system, as well as the perpetrators, the majority, so to speak. And that is, it's that struggle that I'm interested in pursuing further. So I'll stop there. I tried to do a lot in a very short time, but hey, this is the new way. So I'm done. Thank you.
Holger, should I jump in or will you? Okay. Thanks so much, Müge. That was just fascinating for me at so many levels, and with the kind of problems that I've been working on around racial justice and mass incarceration in the United States. I saw many points of connection. I appreciate challenging the narrative of American exceptionalism and the comparative analysis. I like that very much. I'd like to begin by asking a couple of questions, putting biggish questions on the table. And I'd just be interested in how you would think about them. And so from the American perspective, there's a lot of interest right now in processes of social healing, I guess I would call them, in the wake of the kinds of collective violence that you were describing perpetrated against minorities. And there's a lot of political talk about this. And I wonder what lessons we might draw from your analysis. For two things I was thinking about it in your talk specifically. One is rituals of historical reckoning and transitional justice processes. And in the American policy and political conversations. There's a lot of talk about this now, and you mentioned reparations as one strand of it. What's the potential for processes like that for what I would call social healing? And the other thing I was thinking about is the political agency of victims and victim groups. And I feel in the American context, we often talk about this in two ways. One is that people bear the scars of trauma. Trauma produces a whole variety of deficits that impairs political agency. But on the other hand, we say those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And the experience of trauma is a wellspring for agency and political creativity and energy and so on. And so I'd love to hear you speak to those questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Those are, of course, wonderful questions, and one that I've had to deal with a lot, especially in the context of the Armenian genocide, since I worked on that for like 20 years. What is important, I think, what struck me at that time when I was dealing with collective violence of the Armenian genocide, so to speak, when I talked to the Turks, as opposed to the Armenians, it was fascinating because with the Turks, they said, why, what happened? Oh, that was a part of the civil war we had or whatever. I mean, so they weren't at all willing to acknowledge the collective violence. That, of course, is the first thing they need to do, is to acknowledge that there is a problem. So the healing process can start, because people argue denial is the last stage of genocide. If you cannot acknowledge some people are wounded, then you cannot proceed. I mean, here in the United States, if you do not think there is systemic racism against Blacks, where do you go from there? I mean, that is the ultimate first recognition. But when you look at Armenians, when I talk to them, you would think that 1915 occurred yesterday, even though it's been like more than 100 years. But that is what I mean by the emotional aspect of the trauma, in the sense that it is still in their minds, because it's unacknowledged, it's with them every day, all the time, and emotionally. And that is, I think, why it is so important in these things to move away from state-centered, top-down sort of committees and such, and focus much more on not the state and what it comes up with top-down, but rather the society at large. Because in the Armenian genocide context, I mean, it's not going to be acknowledged unless society changes its orientation towards what's going on. So I think that is very important, is sort of you have to bring societal participation into it, civil society, different various groups that work, and try to get them to come together to at least come up with a social movement within it. So transitional justice, therefore, shouldn't only focus on the state, but bring in societal elements, and B, when they do bring those elements, they'll have to think about things in the long term, generationally, how people process collective violence changes as well. Because the first generation, the Armenian survivors have a very different take, and interestingly enough, they like Turks because they have lived with Turks and of course survived the genocide. But if you go another generation or two, the Armenians, when I gave talks, would come to me and say, please, we do not want to live with this hatred because of Turks, because that is what came down to our generation from the violence. Basically, the event, the experience disappears, and you only have this knowledge, racialized, biased, perverted knowledge that you have to deal with. So that is, I think, what needs to be brought in. With respect to the political agency of victims and victim groups, this is extremely difficult because in a way, you have to privilege and bring out their experiences and their knowledge, the way they process society on an everyday basis, because the racism and the violence they face is ongoing all the time. I mean, so that is an important aspect of it. But at the same time, I am arguing what is missing is what's the white majority doing every day and randomly to actually get this going? Because what happens, of course, is in both cases, the violence is always projected on the victims, and what the perpetrators did in the way they set the system up and rigged it, in the way they then process it on an everyday basis, all that I think has not been studied adequately. And that's why I think we have studies of whiteness, for example, in American society. And hopefully we will one day have studies of Turkishness in the Turkish context in a similar way. Thank you.
Thank you, Müge. I'll take over because we have a question from Zera Arat. Zera, I hope you can unmute yourself, otherwise Sharon will do it. But please ask your question.
Hello, Müge. It has been ages. Wonderful to see you. And thank you for a really very rich and informative presentation. And I am not sure if I observed everything, but thank you. I have two questions. One is pretty straightforward. One may be a bit more involved. I saw urban in the definition of majority in Turkey, and I would like to know why you felt the need to have that specification.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, well, your presentation is so full, and so maybe indirectly you answered this, and so, but can you be a bit more specific about how you factor in the goals and means of violence? And I mean, these are all subjugated people, discriminated against. And I don't know, maybe as a human rights scholar, I tend to focus more on the perpetrators. And at different times, different kinds of violence tools were used, and perhaps because the goals were different. And within that, one of the things that apply to both the US context and the Turkish context is the use of assimilation as I guess, means of, the form and means of violence, maybe we can say. And where do you place that in your three type of violence? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Zehra Kabasakalarat, and I went to high school in Turkey, Robert College as it's known, yes, and we've been
and university too.
And university too, of course. Then we had the Boğaziçi, yes, where we were trying to settle the future of Turkey, and now obviously we have nothing to do with it, and here we are in another country having a hard time going back. So here we go. I mean, you know, we are also personally involved in all of this ourselves. Why urban? I mean, you know, one thing about Western European modernity that people have argued that it is very much based on the sort of urban industrial experience as such, so that the model that emerges with respect to reason, rationality, sort of structuring society is very much focused on the changes in the urban, space rather than the rural countryside. And this becomes significant in two contexts. In the context of Turkey, if you think about it, most of the Kurds, of course, were initially in the southeast and in not urban areas as such. I mean, and that had a lot to do with the emergence of PKK, Partiya Kerkeren Kurdistan, and others were much more rural engagements that were different. in the use of violence than the urban ones. This is also the case with Armenians, where urban Armenians, for example, did not take a stand against the Ottoman Empire the way rural Armenians did. So that is that dimension. And when you look at also the United States, of course, you see that, especially sort of northern industrial places are very much focused on what, of course, is happening at, Black people as workers, free workers, as opposed to, of course, if you look at the South, the agriculture, there, the rural dynamics are more different. And I think we haven't taken this into account, which may explain also the polarization we have in our society in the United States today between sort of the blue states, if you think about it, and the red states, I think, also in a way reflect this almost urban-rural divide that I'm trying to capture. So that's the spatial aspect of this. With respect to the use of assimilation, of course, I mean, and in that context, for example, neoliberalism becomes very important. The Justice and Development Party today tries to lure Kurds as Muslims first, rather than as ethnic racial, Kurds first, to incorporate them into the body politic by silencing that dimension, their ethnicity and race. So that is how you're supposed to be going about. And likewise, if you think about minorities in the United States, they can make it in the system insofar as they suppress their identities and play according to the rules set by the white majority. So that is yet another way in which you see this inequity playing itself out. And yes, that is always the challenge. But the fact that money doesn't enable you to, break into the system demonstrates that assimilation does not work. It's what I think the white majority wishes to happen, but it doesn't, because we do not take them and respect the difference and take them on their own words as to how they want to come into the system. We do not let them define it. We define it for them. So there is this patronizing aspect, of course, to white majority who are always used to making the rules of everything, including assimilation of minorities into society, and that ought to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Müge. I have a question from Andreas Wimmer. Andreas.
Yes, Andreas.
Hi, Müge. Thanks for this talk. It was wonderful to hear you and to hear about your new project. I'm a big fan of unorthodox comparisons, and yours is definitely an unorthodox comparison, I would say. And I would like to probe you a little bit of what exactly it is that you want to do by comparing slavery with ethnic violence in Turkey. So, and I'm going to ask two questions. The first is, there's a large literature in sociology and in political science on all these topics, especially on violence against minorities. There's Michael Mann, there's Randall Collins in sociology, in political science, it's a whole subfield. And I wonder, what is your contribution to this whole field? And you haven't mentioned a single author, other authors working on violence. You mentioned post-colonialism, Du Bois, and so on. None of this is really on the topic. So I was wondering, what is your contribution to that large literature? And then the second one is, could you help me understand what you want to do with this comparison, this unorthodox comparison? Do you want to show that violence has similar causes? Well, probably not, because the Turkish configuration leading to the Armenian genocide and then later on to the Turkish conflict is so different from a context emerging from a history of slavery and then post-slavery emancipation, lynchings, and so on. It's a very different configuration. So I cannot imagine that you want to ask the question of the origins of violence, the causes of violence. So do you want to show that violence has similar consequences for those perpetrating it and also for those who are victims? So does it have So despite the different origins, the different historical causal connections leading to violence here and there, maybe it has similar effects on those perpetrating and those who are victimized by it? Or do you want to show that violence is a necessary ingredient of power relations everywhere?
Yeah.
And in more subtle or less subtle form, the nation state is a violent institution with its idea of majoritarianism and so on embedded in it. That would be kind of an Anthony Giddens argument, who wrote a book called The Nation State as Violence. So I was just wondering whether you could help me a little bit understand of where exactly you want to go with this project.
Thank you. I mean, as always, that is an amazing question that comes right into the heart of the matter. This is, I think, one that I am very interested in terms of the sort of the crisis that we see in sociology today, because I think there is a divide in the sense that there are sort of mainstream sociologists who sort of take the social structure as sort of given and then describe how things are done to understand, you know, why we have the polarization we have today. But I think it is very hard because of the chasm that has developed between the majority and minorities to start a conversation among them, I mean, between the two parties, the victims and the perpetrators, so to speak. And unless you do that, of course, it becomes very difficult to bring in the perspective of the minorities. That is probably the most important thing, because we have some work that's being done in sociology that literally reproduces the status quo, and then we have some other work like post-coloniality and others that are trying to change that by coming from the vantage point of minorities as opposed to the majority. So one has to, sociologically, I'm trying to see how can you basically start a conversation between the mainstream sociologists and critical sociologists, so to speak, in developing a global sociology. That is one aspect of it. The other one has to do with the sort of the assumptions that emerge because of the way the majority and minorities have defined violence. They do it much more sort of exhaustively in their own little boundaries within their own life and realities. But I think what is missing from all the people who study violence is, I would say, critical subjectivity, self-reflexivity, because none of the sort of people who are engaged in studying violence do not see themselves as scholars, as a part of the same violence and its interpretation that is going on. I mean, that's what I'm also trying to alert people, is to focus on us as scholars, as interpreters of violence. How much do we then demonstrate that violence is a necessary ingredient everywhere, which is what I would argue, or how much do we then instrumentalize and politicize violence for our own interests? I think that is probably the intervention I make, is by bringing us as scholars into the conversation of violence, because I think we are one of the participants, at least in interpreting it. And that is the kind of self-reflexivity, I think, that is necessary to increase empathy and also tolerance, and also it will allow us to open the space for the minorities then to define what violence is themselves, rather than us doing the interpretation for them. I hope that's at least a partial answer. But it is a huge project, and I'm just starting, so who knows where we end up with it.
Thank you, Müge.
Okay. Thank you.
I have one more question by Armin Masobian. Armin, if you unmute yourself.
Hello, Armin.
Hi, Müge. Nice to see you.
Same here.
When you were laying out this very large framework, I kept thinking with regard to a major difference, and what wasn't mentioned at all by you, between the two societies, is the role that immigration has played in the United States, which it hasn't in Turkey at all, as far as I can understand, in the late 19th century to early 20th century. So clearly the majority, in a way, has been much more stable within Turkish society than in the United States. And this gets to the issues, I think, of also intersectionality. And I you know, when you first had the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, I kept thinking that, well, I'm sure if you look at, you know, the extremes of white supremacy and such, the ethnicity and background of these people are going to be so mixed. You're not going to find that kind of purity among perpetrators as you might find in the Turkish case. So what?
Well, thank you, Arman. It's great to see you, and that's a wonderful question. Now, it's fascinating, of course, the role immigration plays. We do assume that obviously the United States, being a white settler society, has very much a lot of immigration, especially from Western Europe, even though there are gradations within that, say among the Italians, and Irish and such. I mean, that eventually gets ironed out as the white middle class develops. But what about Turkey? I mean, Turkey is supposed to have sort of this purity, but it doesn't. I mean, I think, backgrounds are just as mixed up. But we have this element of purity that somehow, for example, in my case, I am a member of the white majority. I did look into my own family tree to see, you know, how pure am I, so to speak, because whenever I gave talks about the Armenian issue, it was fascinating because I had Armenians come to me afterwards saying, you cannot be a Turk because what you say is very civilized and makes sense. So your blood must have been mixed up with some Armenian blood to civilize what you have to say. The same argument also held for the Turks that would come and say, obviously what you say doesn't make any sense because you probably have some Armenian blood in you that has totally subverted and perverted what you had to say, so that you're saying things that are nonsensical against Turkish interests, and therefore what you say is wrong. So whenever I realize that the radicals on either side basically are making the same argument as to who I am, and that also demonstrates how significant our subjectivities as scholars are in approaching this. And in the Turkish context, the purity of Turkishness is used, instrumentalized to legitimate the violence, to make sure the impure elements are removed, of course. So in a way then, immigration and immigrants sort of play different roles in different times. And I would disagree with you about immigration into the Ottoman Empire and later Turkish Republic. In that context, the Balkan Wars are very important, of course, 1912-13. That's when you have a massive flow of sort of Turkish peasants, mostly immigrants from the Balkans on the one side, and also Muhajir, basically Circassian and other Muslim Turkic minorities from the Russian Empire come into the empire in a way that changes the population makeup very significantly. And that is one step, that enables eventually the Turkish nation state to form. So I totally agree that, forced or natural immigration plays, I think, a significant role in both contexts. But in order to sort of interpret what are the boundaries of that, how does it then shape an individual or an Armenian or a Kurd in the United States, in Turkey, or a black person, or an Armenian like you or me as a Turk in the United States? I think those are, very different ways of looking at things, but I think they could be compared on equal terms because, as I said, of how we approach it. If we use the same parameters as I did say with respect to immigration, both in the Turkish and the United States context, we get some elements that demonstrate that violence is a necessary ingredient that works in different ways in different contexts, but it will stop us, I think, especially if we have self-reflexivity, in making assumptions and instrumentalizing violence in the way it has been instrumentalized before, and instead maybe allow us to develop a space within which we have the conversation across these groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Müge. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I have two more people in the chat and lined up for very quick questions and very quick answers. Gonja, would you like to go ahead with a very quick question? And then I have Abdullah Tanzel as well with a very quick question, and then we will have to draw this to a close, unfortunately. Gonja.
Thank you very much for giving me the time. I'm going to make it even shorter. If Professor Göçek would care to say anything about the subject of what's happening in the Caucasus right now, because I guess I would assume that it's not possible for us to discriminate what is happening there with what has happened back in 1915, and if she cares to say a few words.
Thank you, Gonja. It's always great to hear from you. Yes, what's happening in the Caucasus, I think demonstrates at least my sort of imperialist tendencies as a comparative historical sociologist, because I think what is happening in the Caucasus with the violence continuing unabated against minorities, it is yet another stage in the fact that we are not able to acknowledge and heal the violence, and therefore it is a way of repeating itself, which was, what I argued in the denial of violence. So I would say that it is one of the last stages of that violence continuing to this day. Likewise, if we look at the United States, you're looking at Black Lives Matter, for example, you can argue that the violence against Black people also continues to this day, which also demonstrate that there's something wrong with the way we're approaching this issue. For it not to, as sociologists, we cannot explain how it persists over time. And that is a big issue, of course, we have to collectively approach. But I think what goes on there in the Caucasus, which is also very dramatic, I think again demonstrates the problems with othering, where that conversation between the perpetrators, victims, and sort of the interlocutors has stopped. And that is, I think, what we need to get going first. Thank you.
Thank you, Müge. And Abdullah Tanzel, last question, very quick.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. Professor Göçek, this was an interesting presentation. However, I'm outside of the field. I'm not a sociologist. The presentation sounded to me somewhat concocted of various concepts. I really couldn't find a conceptual framework or the theory you're proposing with somewhat well-defined concepts that are logically related to one another. Forgive me if I am too critical, and you can disregard my comments if you don't like it, because I'm outside of the field. My question is, the topic of the conversation is Kurdish minority in Turkey and Blacks in United States. And I was hoping to find some interesting observations, similarities or contrasts, which I failed. When I look at the Kurds in Turkey, I have one observation. There is definitely violence in the past and currently, and I'm not talking about it. The Kurdish people in Turkey and Turkish people are extremely intertwined. I mean, they make up the fabric of Turkey. And it's an important observation in my mind. How do you explain it, and where do you put it into in your theory? I'm sorry, I didn't want to be hard on you, and that's not my intention. And as a distant scholar, I'm just aggressively questioning or thinking.
It's all welcome. I very much welcome intellectual criticism. You can be as harsh with it as you want. That's what we do as scholars, is to contest all of this. I think the fact that they are very intertwined goes to demonstrate that even though, if you look at the way society is operating, they seem to be all, of course, participating in it equally. But if you look at the norms, values, institutions, foreign policy, or domestic policy, policies developed by the Turkish state and its governments, they are not done by recognizing the Kurds as a separate social group. They always we are all supposed to be Turks that live in Turkey. So even though they are there, I agree the Kurds are there, the society, the imaginary, the social imaginary of Turkey does not include the Kurdish reality in it, the Kurdish elements in it, the way it does the Turkish elements. I mean, so there is an inequity there. Likewise, I would argue in the United States, again, Black people are very much integrated in both the North and the South. But if we look at the social imaginary of American society at large, and I think we are doing that as a way of reckoning with the COVID virus, which sort of enabled us to sort of step back as life stopped for like 6 to 8 months and take notice of what is and is not working in our society. And I think that is how the social problem of Black violence sort of came up again, because it is still continuing to this day. And I would argue that the social imaginary of the United States that is predicated at the time on the norms, values, and practices of white majority, will it then make space with BLM and others, of course, with the Me Too and everything, to open spaces for the participation of those that have been kept out of the body politic? So that is the sort of similarity that I see across. And in a way then, when explaining this, rather than sort of saying, oh, it's culture, it's religion, one thing or another, you then try to compare the two and see the similarities and differences. So you do not particularize one experience, but broaden the horizons of what sociological analysis is and what analysis of violence is, by bringing these in both contexts. That is probably what I'm intending to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Müge. I wish we had another hour to go through the chats. What I will make sure is that you get the chat and that you can respond to some of the comments that have been put in the chat privately to the people who have asked the questions. So thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. Thank everybody for sticking it out until 1:30. And we hope to see you at a future event. And join me in thanking Professor Göçek once again for her talk and for responding to the questions. Thank you all, and I hope to see you very soon.
Thank you all. To be continued. Bye-bye.